Hello and welcome to the June Consulting webinar. My name is Michael Mathis. I am the VP of CDI Solutions, and today we will be graduating from user to developer and go through a tour of the Laserfiche API and SDK. If you have questions during today's presentation, please feel free to post questions in the questions box at any time. We will be monitoring questions throughout the webinar, and we will have time for questions after today's webinar as well. Some tips for success for today's webinar. Be sure to take notes and screenshots. I find it helpful to notate how far along into the webinar we are. Don't be afraid to ask questions. We do love to hear all of your questions. Please complete the survey afterwards. All of your feedback is very valuable, and we love hearing your ideas for future webinar topics. And lastly, remember that this webinar will be recorded and available on the CDI YouTube page within a few days of the webinar. If you're not yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. Graduating from user to developer, a tour of the Laserfiche API and SDK. The intended audience for today's webinar are Laserfiche developers and Laserfiche administrators. If you're not a Laserfiche administrator or developer, please stay in the webinar. There will be plenty of valuable information for everyone. And this webinar is going to be applicable to both Laserfiche self-hosted environments and Laserfiche cloud environments. The agenda for today's webinar will be a comparison of the Laserfiche API and the Laserfiche SDK, the benefits of the new Laserfiche API, benefits that are only available in the SDK. We will be discussing some advice and considerations for building integrations for Laserfiche Cloud. And finally, we will go through a live demo. To get started, we'll look at a couple of definitions today. An API is an application programming interface. And what that means is it's a communication protocol between two applications. This is going to allow for sharing data between two applications, performing actions within that application, etc. APIs are very specific to the application and will vary greatly. An SDK, or a software developer kit, is a toolkit used to build applications. And these will contain libraries and APIs that will assist with building new integrations and integrating with that application. One question I get asked a lot is, isn't the Laserfiche SDK and an API, aren't they the same? Or isn't an API a subset of an SDK? Laserfiche uses these two terms to differentiate between the Laserfiche API, which is a set of RESTful web APIs allowing for interaction with the Laserfiche repository, and also allowing interactions with lookup tables in Laserfiche Cloud. When talking about the Laserfiche SDK, we're referring more to the .NET framework and Java libraries available for building powerful integrations and applications. The Laserfiche SDK allows full access to all repository functions, assuming the authenticated user has permissions to perform those actions, whereas the Laserfiche API is a little more narrow in scope and is a newer API, therefore doesn't have as many features yet. To compare the Laserfiche API and SDK, both are available to cloud and self-hosted environments. And the Laserfiche API is included for free. For self-hosted environments, this is part of your Laserfiche server licensing. For cloud clients, this is going to be part of your Laserfiche Cloud subscription. The Laserfiche SDK is available as an add-on module that can be purchased separately. Documentation is always a big part of APIs and SDKs. The Laserfiche API documentation is available online using Swagger, which makes it easy to play with the API and perform test operations with the API without needing to write any code. The local help files available for the SDK contain some sample code as well as information on how to use the SDK, authentication, etc. The Laserfiche API can be used in any language that supports sending and receiving HTTP requests. We can use the API with Postman or with the online Swagger playground that is available. The Laserfiche SDK is only supported for .NET Framework and Java. Unfortunately, the SDK does not support .NET Core. Rate limiting is always a big pain point with applications that perform a lot of requests. And the Laserfiche API is rate limited. For cloud, for self-hosted installations with the Laserfiche API, there are not rate limits. The rate limits and other API limitations can be viewed in the Laserfiche help documentation. And to expand the API limits, you can contact your Laserfiche account manager for information and pricing there. The Laserfiche SDK is not going to be rate limited. There are still some concurrency limitations on operations such as searching and listing folder contents. However, those limitations are a lot larger than what is available with the API. UI components. The Laserfiche API provides UI components that are available via NPM for use within your custom applications. You will not need to write your UIs from zero. Laserfiche does provide some components that we will look at soon for building a user interface. With the Laserfiche SDK, unfortunately, there are not any UI components available. However, with the SDK, you are able to build your own UI components and provide more functionality than what would be available within the UI components from the API. Now that we've seen a comparison of the two, let's take a look at some benefits of the Laserfiche API. One of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, would be the Laserfiche marketplace integrations. There are a lot of integrations available on the Laserfiche marketplace, and all of the integrations that are powered by partner connections, MuleSoft, or Boomi will use the Laserfiche API. The Laserfiche API is lighter weight than the Laserfiche SDK. There is no local installation needed for developers. It is all REST requests using HTTP. There are client libraries and UI libraries available that can be added to projects using NPM. And these are provided by Laserfiche API to simplify calls to the API. So instead of needing to send those HTTP requests yourself, you can use the Laserfiche client libraries, which will provide that IntelliSense and all of the wonderful benefits of an IDE. The Laserfiche UI library will provide common user interface components such as a metadata control and a folder browser. There's also a login component that can be used, as well as a couple other components we'll take a look at. For the Laserfiche SDK, the SDK is a lot more powerful. It allows performing virtually any action within your Laserfiche repository. One of the big benefits is it allows for performing records management actions for those of you with Records Management Edition. As of version 2 of the Laserfiche API, they do not yet have records management functionality, but the Laserfiche SDK has full control over records management. With the SDK, there is no rate limiting. You can make as many calls through the SDK as you need or want. Concurrency limits do exist around various calls, such as searching and folder listings, as I had mentioned previously. And just because the SDK calls are not rate limited does not mean you can call them repeatedly. It is a very good practice to cache data locally and only make those calls to the SDK when needed. Another great benefit available in the SDK is the document services library. This is going to allow performing operations such as import and exporting of documents and OCR and text extraction. Import and export is available through the Laserfiche REST API. And for cloud clients, OCR and text extraction is going to be performed automatically in the background. However, with self-hosted environments, OCR and text extraction are not performed automatically in the background, so document services will be a great solution to automate some of that. When building integrations with Laserfiche, there are going to be many considerations to take into account. I'm going to highlight just a couple of the biggest considerations today regarding when you should use the Laserfiche API or SDK. The first consideration is what type of integration are we going to be building? Is this going to be an image enablement integration where we're going to allow users to view or add documents or view or modify metadata through a user interface that's either going to be standalone or embedded in a third-party application? Are we building a third-party integration? Are we connecting with an external application? Are we going to be transferring data or records between that third-party application and the Laserfiche repository? And lastly, are we doing a bulk data processing integration? Are we importing and exporting a lot of documents? Are we going to be synchronizing data between 2 or more systems? Are we doing any sort of custom data processing or data transformations that are not going to be possible using the Laserfiche API directly? Next, where is our integration going to be hosted or installed? Are we going to be building something that's going to be installed locally or on a server such as a Windows desktop application or a Windows service that runs in the background? Are we going to take a more modern serverless approach, which would be more likely what would happen with a Laserfiche Cloud environment, where we're going to be serving either a single page application or a web application? For our image enablement applications, which again will allow for viewing or adding documents or viewing or modifying metadata, etc., I would recommend using the Laserfiche API. The Laserfiche API provides the UI components to be able to quickly build your integration without needing to write all of that UI on your own. If you're building a Windows desktop project, you can use the WebView 2 library available from Microsoft to embed a web page within your Windows desktop application. If we're building an integration with third-party applications, so we're connecting with an external application, transferring data between our applications, we can use the Laserfiche API if our third-party application allows for sending custom REST API requests. So if our third-party application allows us to write that web request that's going to be sent to the Laserfiche REST API, I would recommend going this route. Or if the third-party application requires a language that's not supported by the Laserfiche SDK, such as .NET Core, or say a JavaScript or a TypeScript application. Otherwise, I would recommend using the Laserfiche SDK. So if your third party requires a custom API that's not supported by the Laserfiche REST API, you could write your own custom API that invokes the Laserfiche SDK to then retrieve or push information to the repository. Or if that third party would consume a lot of rate-limited resources. So for example, that third-party application is going to be sending over hundreds or thousands of files at a time to be imported into the repository. At that point, the SDK would be a better option to reduce the number of rate-limited calls that are consumed and to improve performance as well, where we wouldn't need to make a separate import call for each file. Lastly, for bulk data processing integrations, where we are going to be importing or exporting documents, performing synchronization of data or custom processing of data, at that point, our best option would be to use the Laserfiche SDK. Using the SDK, we're not going to be rate limited on the number of calls being performed. Processing will be faster due to not having to send web requests. And we can also easily access external data such as SQL Server or other APIs or local files. The options are limitless. Next, we'll take a quick look at some options for moving existing SDK integrations to Laserfiche Cloud. And luckily, most integrations should not need significant changes. You can continue to use the Laserfiche SDK in your current integration. However, it is recommended to use version 10.4 or newer of the SDK. From my personal experience, the Laserfiche SDK is very backwards and forwards compatible from version 9.2 onwards. However, if you're using any newer functionality, you'll definitely need to use a newer version of the SDK. A major change that will be needed for integrations would be changing the authentication and/or session creation. Best practice is going to be to sign in once and cache that session as long as your application is alive or as long as that user is signed in. Authentication calls are very expensive. They take really the most time out of any calls. So caching that session is going to greatly improve the performance of your applications. We'll also need to use the laserfiche.repository_access.cloud ticket class to authenticate to the Laserfiche repository. There is documentation in the Laserfiche SDK documentation on how to authenticate to Laserfiche Cloud and to a local self-hosted Laserfiche repository. Lastly, we're going to try to reduce the round trips. So when possible, cache your data instead of making another call. Instead of retrieving that Laserfiche document every time we're going to work with it, can we cache that document? Can we hold that reference in memory until we are fully done with that resource? And when you're done with resources, when you're removing them from your cache or your memory, be sure to call dispose to fully release that resource. What I've seen when not calling dispose is Laserfiche will keep read and write locks on documents or folders, and later you'll be wondering why that document is locked. It shouldn't be locked. I'm not using it anymore. You'll beat your head against the wall for a while. It's never happened to me. Be sure to call dispose. That way Laserfiche will release all of those locks, release those resources when you're done using them. At this point, we don't have any questions to go over before we jump into our demo. If there are any questions, please definitely post them in the question section. And today, for our live demonstration, we will be building a Angular single-page application that's going to allow public users to upload files to our Laserfiche repository. We're going to start with a sample application that's available from Laserfiche on their GitHub repository. And we're going to modify the application to remove our login component and to use the service principal for authentication. To get started, I will pull up the Laserfiche developer site, and this is going to have fantastic resources for Laserfiche developers. The Laserfiche developer documentation will give you an overview of the Laserfiche API, how to authenticate, and how to access the Swagger Playground. And this is available at developer.laserfiche.com. I do also have links in the resources section of the slide deck that will include all of these URLs as well. Under getting started, this will give us an overview of the Laserfiche developer console and how to access that. It will describe the Laserfiche API limits and provide us with a link to the service limits page. And this is where we can view really all of the individual rate limits that are imposed on the API. So for example, our general APIs were able to make 100 calls per minute. After that, our rate limit is going to kick in, and we'll have to wait until that rate limit timeout resets. Under guides, we have a lot of information here for how to use the API to create folders, create documents, work with metadata, perform searches. Under building Laserfiche apps, this is where we can view the resource library and the UI components and get access to the documentation. And lastly, under APIs, this is going to give us the links to our NPM packages and documentation for the API client libraries. So to get started on our application we'll build today, we're first going to go to our Laserfiche developer console. And our requirements are going to be to create an application that is going to be accessible to public users. So we will create a new application, and this is going to be a service application because we will not be prompting for end user credentials. So here we'll create our application. And this brings us to the configuration page. And here we can see service apps require a valid service principal and at least one access key to be usable. So we will need to create a service principal for our application, and we can do that under the account section. And by selecting service principals under the user section, we can then create a new service principal. We'll call this one June webinar. And for our groups, I'm going to add this to our everyone group. This will provide the appropriate access rights to the user. And under repository, we are going to allow access to the repository. Here we will create our service principal, and that is now going to be available to select in our service principal dropdown. I did name that June, yes, okay. So we have our service account selected. And lastly, we'll need to save our changes. And next, under authentication, here we can select the OAuth scope. So we're going to allow repository.read to allow reading information from the repository, as well as repository.write to allow writing to the repository. We can update our scopes and create our key. Here we're going to create an access key for accessing the API from our Laserfiche API client library. And we can then create our key. For the sample app we'll be using today, this is available on the Laserfiche GitHub page, as well as many other samples. So if we scroll down to find a repository, we'll filter by sample, and we're going to use the LF sample OAuth SPA. I'm going to download this as a zip file. And we will pull this out to my sample folder. Whoops, wrong button. Okay, first thing we're going to do is open up PowerShell or a command prompt and install the npm packages that were included in the sample project. So we'll run npm install and give that just a moment to install everything. We could also do this inside of Visual Studio Code, but Visual Studio Code likes to complain about those missing packages even after they're installed without restarting VS Code. All right, now that our npm packages are installed, let's open up our solution or our project with code. And in the solution, we have our pre-built app component. So this is the default code from Laserfiche. And what we can do is, let's start running this. So we'll serve our application just to see what comes up out of the box. First thing we'll notice is it takes a couple seconds to build the application. It builds a lot faster without running the webinar at the same time. There it is. Okay, so that brings us to our Save to Laserfiche sample application. And our first requirement of the integration was we were going to remove our login component. So if we go back to Laserfiche, or I'm sorry, to Visual Studio Code, we are going to remove this chunk of code and the code at the bottom to remove our login, and now we can see all of our UI components. I jumped in just a little bit too early. I wanted to go over some of those components that are available before I jumped in here. So if we go back to the Laserfiche GitHub repository, we can look for the LFUI components, and this will have the documentation. There's also a documentation link in the developer guide, and they'll both take you to the same place. So they'll give you an overview of the UI components and what they're available, or what is available. They do have two pre-built themes. So we have our Laserfiche theme or the Microsoft theme. Changing this on other pages looks a lot more fun. For UI components that are available, there is a feedback dialog, which will bring users to the feedback page where they can submit feedback. The LF login component will allow users to sign in through your app, either by redirecting or showing a pop-up to log in. Under lists and trees, they do have their breadcrumb components, so we can see folders that are available, as well as, I thought there was a way, it's in the repository browser where that shows up better. Under the checklist, they do have their checklist box, and this would be useful if you are going to allow users to apply tags, so they can check the tag that they want applied and enter their description. The Laserfiche repository browser is going to allow users to browse through your Laserfiche repository. You're able to limit what entry types are available, so folders or documents or records folders. And this is where the breadcrumb looks a little bit better. And lastly, we are going to be using the LF field container component today. And this is going to allow us to populate metadata on documents that we are going to upload to the Laserfiche repository. So we have our folder browser that is not working because we're not authenticated, as well as our metadata control. If we go back to our app components, Laserfiche has a lot of great sample code in here for various things that could, would, should be needed. It allows working with the login component to log into your repository or allow users to log in with their credentials. It shows how to populate the folder browser and a lot of other great information. So to get started, we are going to clean up a little bit of this code. So we're going to remove our access token code here. We're not using an access token. And we are going to remove our make repo client from login component because we are going to be using our OAuth service principal. So the Laserfiche repository API client is going to be the class that is used to really initialize and create the API client. We have a lot of options available for creating that client, so we can create from an access key, which is what we'll be doing today. For self-hosted clients, you can create from a username and password to log into your self-hosted repository. And there's also a create from HTTP request handler that will allow you to perform any custom logic for authentication that will be needed. So today we're going to create from our access key, and this is going to need a few pieces of information. The first thing we'll need is our service principal key. So if we go back to our service principal in our account administration, we have our option to create our service principal keys. Clicking that button will generate our keys, and remember, these can only be accessed one time. Be sure to save these in a safe location. And do not just copy to the clipboard and say finish like I am doing today. So our service principal key is going to be entered. Next, we need our access key. And this was created when we created our application in the developer console. So here it provides us with the access key. And again, this is only available once. Once we close out of this dialog, we are not able to get this again. So save this to a safe location. Do not just copy and close out of the dialog like I am doing today. And the last option is the scope. So we can either leave this as undefined, or we can provide specific scopes that we want to use for our application. I'm going to provide the scopes of repository.read and repository.write. When we save our changes and refresh our application, we should now be able to browse our repository. There we go. We are able to authenticate as that service user. We can see our repository list as well as the columns that are available. If we navigate through the list, we can see our breadcrumbs populating. And this is going to allow us to go back up our repository tree to go to, say, our incoming scans folder. So in incoming scans, we'll select this folder. Whoops, I cannot select yet because I forgot to make another change. So again, we are not using our login component, and we will provide our web access URL here because we are not getting that from our login component anymore. Okay, now that we have that saved, we should be able to browse to our folder. We'll select incoming scans and select. Perfect. We'll browse to a file. That is not the folder I wanted. Let's upload sample 5. And now we have the ability to save to Laserfiche, but first I want to apply some metadata from the repository. So we can apply our client documents template, populate our date and time, and some field information. Now if we save to Laserfiche, we have our pop-up, successfully saved a document to Laserfiche. So that's fantastic. However, let's prove it. I need my account ID here. So, oh, crumble, crumble. Okay, let's try a different browser. So if we refresh our incoming scans, we can see our sample file here with our metadata applied. If we click on our document, that will then open the document in our browser for us. Let's take a look at another upload. So again, we can browse to a folder, and we have the option here to add a new folder. Let's name this June webinar. We'll go into our June webinar folder and select. Instead of sample 5, let's go with sample 2, and we'll save to Laserfiche. Perfect. Back to our repository, we can refresh. And we have our June webinar folder, as well as sample 2 with our metadata applied. So that will conclude the live demo portion of today's webinar. Resources for developers are going to be developer.laserfiche.com, where we had seen the documentation for the API. There is the Laserfiche API Swagger documentation, where we can perform web requests and view all of the available operations, such as the operations we can perform on entries. Expanding one of our sections will allow us to test out our API call through the browser. So we can click our Try It Out button, populate the information, and execute the request. The Laserfiche GitHub page has multiple repositories where you can view documentation as well as view some of the source code for sample applications. And the Laserfiche Marketplace is going to have a wide variety of integrations and processes pre-configured that you can use in your Laserfiche environment. There are other additional resources such as Laserfiche Answers, the Laserfiche Support portal, and the CDI YouTube page where you can access additional information. And you can always feel free to contact us at professionalservices@citiesdigital.com, sales@citiesdigital.com, or support@citiesdigital.com. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I am Michael Mathis, the VP of Solutions at CDI, and we have about 10 minutes left in our time today for any questions that you may have. If you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to consulting, sales, or support. I do see a question. What is the difference in setting up the API for a self-hosted environment? That is a great question, and there is information available in the Laserfiche developer page for the self-hosted API. Here it is, self-hosted server. So there's information on prerequisites, configuration, and where to download the Laserfiche API server installer. All right, I don't see any other questions. So again, thank you everyone for your time today. And if there are any other questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you at our next webinar.